Here we go. Let's prove God's existence. We're going to do it. And we're not just going to do it once. You know, like if God does exist, you'd probably only really need to do it once. We're going to do it 3 and maybe even 4 times if we count the 4th one as a proof. Might be more of a gamble, but you know, it's up to you. Okay, so there are 3 classical forms of proof for God's existence. This lecture I've given several times. It's like my favorite lecture to give all semester, because I think it's just super fun to go through the incredibly simple and yet wonderfully elegant arguments for the existence of God. And the original genesis of this lecture was in a intro to logic class that I taught, because it turns out with just the very basics of your principles of propositional logic, so like a month worth of class, you can understand the formalization of all of the proofs for God's existence, at least the classical ones. And of those, there are 3 types. There are ontological proofs, cosmological proofs, and teleological. So we'll start with a cosmological proof. What does it mean to be a cosmological proof? Well, it's a deductive proof. So it's going to use premises and inferences, and these inferences will be validly inferred from their premises. Whether or not the premises are true would determine whether or not the argument is sound. This is all sort of just logic speak, but the argument is also theoretical. So it's the sort of thing that you don't need any, I mean, it probably helps, but you don't need any experience in the world in order to work through the principles of the argument. The principles of the argument are theoretical, just like based on how we reason and what our intuitions of our inferential intuitions are. We could come to construct a cosmological proof. Now, the same is going to be true for ontological proofs as well. They're theoretical and they're deductive, meaning that the conclusion is necessitated by the premises, given that it's going to be a valid argument. These 2 forms of proof are to be contrasted with the teleological proof for God's existence, which is an inductive proof. So in logic, we have, I've said deductive and inferences following from premises necessarily. In logic, there is a division between inductive and deductive logic, where deductive logic deals with necessary rules and laws of inference that given, so like think of deductive logic as kind of like to sentences as physics is to objects, that we can measure and map out exactly how fast and with what force objects are moving through the world, at least in sort of simplified paradigms in a physics class. Same thing can be said of a deductive logic class. We can determine how and what is to be inferred or is entailed, or how certain sentences and meanings hook together given the logical structure, the deductive logical structure of these sentences. Okay, so this is to be contrasted with inductive logic, which doesn't deal with like necessary laws and rules of inference, but rather with probabilities. So an inductive logic is one of could be and probably is or probably isn't, right? So from the outset, we should be able to tell that there's a distinction between this inductive kind of proof, which is dealing with probabilities, and these deductive proofs, which are dealing with rules and laws of inference. Also, similarly, we should note that the teleological proof is empirical. It's not just a theoretical. You could come up with it just by reflecting on rational principles. You also, for a teleological proof, should be engaged with and measuring the world. That something about the world is going to make it more likely for God to exist than not, is sort of the upshot of a teleological proof. So we'll start with the 2 deductive ones because they're sort of in the same family, and then we'll look at the teleological proof last. And then once we're done with all of that, if we still have some time, which I think we probably will, we'll do Pascal's wager, which is a bet on God's existence, that like whether or not God exists sort of doesn't matter, but we're better off betting on God's existence, argues Pascal. Okay, so we'll start with the ontological proof, which comes to us from St. Anselm, who we read some of for today. So this is St. Anselm with his very cool stick and pointy hat. The ontological proof, ontology is a study of being. I've used this word a few times in the class. Ontos is the Greek for being, logos, again, reason. So what are the principles of being? So again, the three kinds of proofs we have: ontological, cosmological, teleological. All of these are going to be sort of like principles based in cosmos, like the way that the cosmos works; ontos, the way that being is in general; or telos, the way that ends are. We sort of touched on telos from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics last week. Here it's a little more empirical in the world than moral in our intentions and why we do what we do. But in any case, ontos, being, logos, principles of. So here's the ontological proof. I'm just going to lay it out for you, premise, conclusion format, and we'll analyze it from there. So 1, God is the being than whom nothing greater can be conceived. Premise 1. Premise 2, God exists as an idea in the mind, meaning like I can think of, like I have an idea of God, right? I'm thinking about God right now. 3, premise, a being that exists in the mind and in reality is greater than a being that exists only in the mind. So here's the idea behind this one. If there is this omnibenevolence, like so perfectly good, omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing being, wouldn't it be better for the world if that sort of being existed, because it's like all good, all powerful, always wants the best for us, sends all of its love and compassion into us and our workings and all that, right? Or would it be better if that sort of being only existed in our heads as an idea? Well, of course, it would be better if it exists in the world, because then it could be like efficacious. It could use its all power to do all good things in our world, and it knows all of the best things to do because it's omniscient, right? So it's better for such a being to exist than to just be a figment of our imaginations. Therefore, given 2 and 3, if God only exists in the mind, then we can imagine something that's greater than God, right? So I have an idea of God in my mind, but it would be better if this thing existed outside of my mind. So if God only existed in my mind, then I can imagine a better sort of being, right? Which is the God that I have in my head is tri-omniperfect, tri-omni being omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, but also exists. I can imagine that being too. But given premise 1, we cannot imagine anything greater than God. God is the being than whom no greater can be conceived. Therefore, God exists in the mind and in reality. You kind of don't even need all of the middle stuff, right? In its classical formulation, it's just 1 and done, like premise 1 complete. But I've sort of split it up for you so you can see the machinations of the proof. Okay, and just to show you, this is a valid proof. That don't try to read this. This is nonsense to you. But this is just to show that you can formulate this proof using modal logic. So the existence of God is necessitated, right? Like God must exist in the strongest form of modal logic, meaning the form of modal logic that's the most restricted and the most complete. So the least amount of principle is inherent in it because it's strict, but it's like the strongest form, S5 modal logic. The existence of God is necessitated given this proof. Right? Alvin Plantinga, I think he's from Notre Dame, though I could be wrong, has a book, Naming and Necessity. No, that's the Kripke one. Something in Necessity, where he proves God's existence is incontrovertible, valid, and in an S5 system sound, which is wild, and that's what this proof is. So this is just to show that like the proof is logically valid, and adheres to all of our natural laws of inference, and within the restricted system of S5 is necessitated. So here's your proof for God's existence? God is that than whom no greater can be conceived, therefore God exists. What's wrong with it? What do you think?
I do the reading, so I'm flying blind. But number one, I mean, why does that have to be true?
Yeah, so we could imagine that God is something other than the greatest thing that we conceive. Now, so Saint Anselm is the one who forwards this proof, right? And being a good God-fearing Christian, believes that God is the sort of thing that's triomniperfect, right? So triomniperfect is sort of like the trifecta of all that you possibly could have in the most amazing, perfect being. This is who like the Christian God is supposed to represent. So God is all-knowing, meaning that for every possible choice out there, God knows what it is and what the consequences of every possible choice will be. God is also omnibenevolent, meaning that it is morally perfect, will always choose the morally best optimal choice. Okay, so not only is God omniscient, knows all of the choices and all of the consequences, also knows their moral worth and value in every case, right? Can see all the way down through the rabbit hole of every single iteration of possibility because omniscient, and will always choose the best of them because omnibenevolent. Now, it may be a problem if there were a being who knew all of the choices and consequences and all of the many iterations of possible worlds out there and which of them was the best, if that being could not also choose it, right? Didn't have the power to actualize and realize such a world, right? Such a string and series of possibilities. So this God must also be omnipotent, all-powerful, so that there is no possible choice that is closed to such a being, right? So this is supposed to motivate premise one, right? And now there might be other issues with premise one, but that at least is like the theistic motivation for proposing premise one. Now, you don't need necessarily theistic motivations or intuitions in order to motivate premise one. We don't need to be Christians or Muslim or Seventh-day Adventist. We don't need to like have any of these intuitions. We can abstract away from any theological conception of God whatsoever and still come up with an ontological proof. I can imagine a perfect thing, right? Completely, absolutely perfect, and not just a perfect thing, but the perfect thing, like the limit of perfection, right? That there is in my mind a conception of a being for whom there are no flaws. And if there are many beings with no flaws, then the greatest of them is the being that I have in my mind. The ontological proof would necessitate the existence of this most perfect, ultimately great being. So does God exist? What do you think? Yeah.
I mean, this is sort of the same objection, but I disagree with the definition of God in that, well, this isn't like when I think of what God is and what a proof for God would look like, I don't think of proving just the greatest thing. I think of proving like the idea that we have God in our minds as being like, those three things and being white man with a beard.
White beardy guy. Yeah.
Like there's more to it than just that.
Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead then. We're going to like roll forward and then we'll roll back to the ontological proof. So I want to make this distinction before we move forward. So there's two conceptions of God that we should keep in mind, right? There's the God of the philosophers and the God of the theologians. And these are two very different gods, though often compatible, right? And often made to overlap. So we'll go back to the ontological proof in just a moment, but this is an important point to bring up this distinction. So when we're talking about the God of the philosophers, this is a God that's proven through reason, as opposed to the God of the theologians who's proven through written and experienced testament, right? the word of the Gospels, the divine messages, the miracles that occurred in the period of Jesus of Nazareth, of Muhammad moving, like, being given the like divine message, that there is a difference in the form of conception or proof, right? What sort of evidence counts as evidence for the God that we're talking about? Philosophers, when even like St. Anselm and Aquinas and stuff, when proving God, they are not concerned with written testament as evidence for God, but rather with what can be proven through reason and reason alone, right? Because ultimately it's going to end up that like reason is the capacity given to man by God for with which we do great works, or whatever, we live in his image, capital H. But for these philosophers and those who are coming up with proofs for God, what will not satisfy is this like written testament history, oral tradition, right? That, like Descartes, right, who gives up his own form of the ontological proof, like Descartes, it's not enough to say, well, I got told this and Aristotle said it once, so it must be right, right? No, you have to prove it for yourself. You have to show incontrovertibly to the strengths and powers of reason that this sort of conclusion is necessary, right? Now, the God of the philosophers is going to be proven this way, and so it's going to be a sort of, it's going to have its valid sort of form, but it loses a lot of its character, right? So what the God of the philosophers has in theoretical strength, it loses in sort of narrative power and nature. The God of the philosophers is the end of argument rather than like faith. It's a conclusion rather than a supposition of faith, I think, is probably the wrong way of putting it, but maybe like the achievement of faith is maybe a way of putting it, is the God of the theologians. And I need a new one of these. The God of the philosophers is purely conceptual usually, whereas the God of the theologians is anthropomorphized also usually, not always. The God of the philosophers is typically conceptually simple, right? Typically what you're getting in this kind of God is the like necessary end of a logical proof determined by the principles of reason, rather than the conceptually complex God who both at the same time loves and, like Christian God in this case, loves and forgives all of mankind with the transubstantiation and resurrection of Christ, and also 1,000 years earlier murdered Job's family and had some fun toying with Isaac and Abraham, dangling knives and lambs and all that. Okay, so we should make this distinction at the outset, that the sort of God that we're interested in with respect to these philosophical proofs is this sort that's on the left here, and not so much the one that's on the right, though again, they are often overlapped, and it's important to recognize like where the gray areas and boundaries are. But what is proven at the end of these proofs is not the God of the theologians, though you do hop, skip, and a jump, theologically speaking, and whatever you prove rationally on the other end of your ontological or cosmological proof, whatever, what have you, you get the Christian God or the Muslim God. Your Abrahamic tradition is sort of built in, baked into what comes on the other end of the proof. Okay, so what's wrong with the argument? God is the being that in whom no greater can be conceived. Therefore, God exists because it would be better for such a thing to exist in the world than in just my mind. Yeah.
So premise 3, a being exists in the mind and reality is better than one that only exists in the mind. If I imagine like the most perfect unkillable spider that there is, I don't know if that would be better.
Good. So this is more of an objection to 1, and it's a historical objection too. So to object to 3 would be to say that the imagination is better than the being in existence, or by existing it isn't made better, right? But if we want to say that God is that being than whom no greater can be conceived, why couldn't we reattribute the name God with X? Scary spider, spooky spider. Spooky spider is the being that than whom no greater can be conceived. I'm imagining the most perfect spider, of whom there are no more perfect spiders. It has 8 legs, is hairy and lots of eyes, and I don't know, eats all the mosquitoes that exist. It's a fantastic spider, omnibenevolent, of course. This objection is historically attributed to Guanillo, who is a contemporary, I think, of Anselm, who doesn't call it a perfect spider because I think it was probably, you don't want to spook your audience as a medieval philosopher. You probably get accused of some kind of Satanism or something. But Guanillo's objection is the perfect island. So I can imagine an island greater than all other islands. It has all of the free mojitos, and it's constantly sunset, sunrise, perfect waves to surf. The sand is warm but not too hot, etc. Right? All of the perfect things about the beach this island has. So we could say that this proof doesn't just prove the existence of God, but the existence of any perfect thing, couldn't we? Or could we?
So
Does anybody want to defend the proof from Guanillo?
Wouldn't it be like a greatest of the greats?
Excellent. Yeah. So Sylvia says, wouldn't there be a greatest of the greats, right? So the idea here is that you couldn't prove the perfect island and the perfect spider and the perfect what have you, right? You get the maximally perfect. You only get one. And whether we call that super awesome spider bro or God doesn't matter, because it's the same thing at the end of the day, right? So this is the historical response to this kind of objection. What else? Does God exist?
So when I meant spider, I meant something like that. So I mean, you could like imagine them as evil.
Oh, yeah, this is a good objection too. Okay, so the objection is different from the Guanillo one. It's not, I can imagine an alternative perfect thing. It's, I can imagine a perfectly malevolent, evil, awful thing. So one of my favorite fantasy book series is the King Killer Chronicles, Name of the Wind, and Wise Man's Fear. It's supposed to be a trilogy. It's been like a decade and a half since Rothfuss has promised us. Yeah, it's true. You're just not allowed. So in this fantasy series, there's this being called the Cathay that is trapped in this Fey realm and guarded day and night. And the story is that it's the most perfect evil thing that exists, such that if it is allowed to even get near any living being, that living being will cause the like destruction of the entire world. Like it just needs to like blow the air in just such a way as to butterfly effect the world into complete chaos, disharmony, and like, right. So it's perfectly evil. So let's take this ontological proof for God's existence and imagine now that rather than the most perfectly good being, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient, we trade out the omnibenevolent for omnimalevolent, right? The being for whom no worse can be conceived. Now, wouldn't it be, now this is an objection to premise 3, okay, so now I understand. A being that exists in the mind and in reality is so much worse than one that just exists in the mind, right? Wouldn't it be awful if our nightmares came to life? So much worse. Therefore, we're living in a nightmare. which might have been the case. Who knows? So this is a good objection too. I don't think that there is a clear response to this kind of objection. I think that it's given if the ontological proof is to be valid, then its inverse in malevolence is also to be valid. It seems to me. Now, you might say something about like existence and like goodness or badness. That would be the only way to sort of keep the proof, but get rid of this alternative. And maybe you're happy with like Satan filling this role if we want to like fit theological stories into like our logical rational proofs. But even then, like in a Christian conception, it's not a super happy thing to have like an equally evil being. The Abrahamic traditions are not ones that involve an equal balance of power between good and evil. It's like God is ultimately good and powerful. Right? So you need to say something interesting about goodness and badness and how like the perfectly malevolent creature wouldn't be worse to exist. Something strange like that. But I think that's the direction I would go if I respond to it. But so far as I know, there's no clear response to such an objection. What else? So we have an objection to premise 3, an objection to premise 1. Does anybody else want to take a stab at the ontological proof? How about online?
The
No.
whole thing feels like a trick, but I can't point at the trick.
Yeah,
It's like
okay.
clearly a trick.
Yeah, so the ontological proof is my favorite argument in all of philosophical history. Like, and it's amazing because you only need premise 1 and then conclusion. God is the being that no greater can be conceived, therefore God exists. It's so simple and so elegant. And you might say, well, it's also circular. It assumes the conclusion in the construction of its premise. And there are some logical objections to the proof as conceived by Anselm in this that than which no greater can be conceived language. When we change around the strictures of logical inference and rules, and we go back to say like Plantinga's modal proof, it gets a little less weird, but the S5 modal world is one that we may not think is the one that we're actually living in, but you need to take an advanced deductive logic course for that, which we teach here. So 3 years of logic and you'll be able to read this. Like, it's not no problem, but less of a problem than it is now for you, I'm sure. Okay, so we could deny premise 1. We could do the perfect island thing. We could also deny premise 2. God exists as an idea in them. Oh yeah, sure. The ontological proof, maybe not. Would thinkers, philosophers be worried about the existence of a perfect being if we didn't have spiritual inclinations and curiosities? I think it's probably a historical empirical question, but my inclination is to say not in the ontological way. In the cosmological way, certainly. Right. So when we get to the cosmological proof, I think regardless of whether or not religion had ever been born from the womb of human spiritual connection to the world and the explanation of mythological thinking and all that, you would certainly get a cosmological proof. It's the most like scientific of the 3 proofs. Well, I mean, it's hard to say. It's the most like a priori analytic of the 3. It's the most like consistent with reason. The teleological proof is probably the most like scientific because it relies on scientific observation to work. Anyways, so we can deny premise 2 that God exists as an idea in the mind, and this is something that David Hume does. Hume says, whatever we imagine is finite, right? All I can see are impressions. I never find any first, I never see me anywhere. I only see like the impressions of the world. So similarly, with respect to God, Hume says, I can't have a conception of an infinite thing. I can't conceive of the maximally perfect being. When you're saying that, you're making it up. You don't actually have this idea in your head. You're mistaken, says Hume. Therefore, we have no conception of the infinite, and we can't actually conceive of that than which no greater can be conceived. We could maybe get close, and probably not even that, and that's not enough for a proof, not at all. Okay. So there's an alternative way of denying premise 3, and this is attributed to Kant. So Kant gives his own what's called a transcendental proof for God's existence. So Kant argues in favor of God's existence. So he says, given the way that the mind represents reality and interprets what the world is and how it experiences the world, we can't help but to believe in God. In the same sort of way that given how the mind constructs reality and interprets the universe and how we act in the world, we can't help but to think we're free. So he calls these transcendental illusions, meaning that the actual like proof in the pudding is beyond the conception or beyond the limits of what the human mind can conceive of. And knowing that there are limits to what the human mind can conceive of, we can press against the walls of our mental experience. We are also sort of just committed to reasoning to the existence of God and to the existence of free will, though we can't actually prove it. We just are sort of required to think it if you think through it enough, says Kant. But anyways, Kant does deny the ontological proof classically, in that he says that existence isn't a property. Okay, so the ontological proof requires that existence be considered like blueness or goodness or hardness or softness or circularity or being, what would be cubular, cubiform? Cubular is probably not a word. Anyways, Kant says existence is not a property like that. Existence, given the way that predicate logic is, existence is something that's used to quantify over objects rather than to describe objects, meaning that when you say that something exists, you're saying that there is an object for which properties can inhere in. Existence is not one of the properties inhering in that object, but existence is like the moniker that enables us to attribute properties at all. And this is, like if you took a 3000 level logic course, you would learn this of predicate logic. But that's Kant's objection. Existence isn't a thing that could make you better or worse because it's not a property, right? And so if existence isn't something that makes you better or worse, then the proof fails. Okay, so I'll also mention we've read Descartes, and when we read and talked about Descartes, I intimated that the rest of the meditations that we didn't read were the place in which Descartes proves God's existence, and with God's existence loops back to verify the clear and distinct ideas, thoughts that he has as incontrovertible, as first foundations for other beliefs, and as good foundations that cannot be shook by, say, like the evil genius sort of doubt, because the existence of a God would make that sort of thing impossible. Okay, so Descartes' proof for God takes an ontological form. And just briefly before moving on, the way that it goes is I have a most perfect idea of God in my mind, just like the ontological proof. But I'm a finite thing. So similar to Hume, but he disagrees with Hume, or Hume would disagree with Descartes, not anachronistically. Descartes thinks that we can have this idea of God. However, Descartes doesn't think we could have caused or created the idea of God, because like Hume, he agrees that we're finite things, we're imperfect. We can only conceive of so much, and yet I have this idea of this omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient being, this most perfect being, the one that than whom no greater can be conceived. I have this idea in my mind, but I am so small and puny and weak, and I can only do so much. So how is it possible that me, being the finite being that I am, could have invented such a perfect conception of the idea of God? So by analogy, say you give like 8 crayons to a toddler and a piece of paper, and then you go and you make dinner in the kitchen, you come back in the room and you find a blueprint for a spaceship, and it's like 3-dimensionalized too, right? And you would look at the toddler and say, well, maybe not to the toddler, but to yourself, like, who put this here, right? The toddler couldn't have used your 4 crayons to 3-dimensionalize a rocket ship on the piece of paper that you gave them, right? That just, the toddler doesn't have the capacity to do that. So finding this this drawing with what Descartes would call greater reality than what the child is capable of producing would mean that something of equal or greater reality would have to create it. So like a space rocket engineer, someone who has a PhD in rocketry and is really good at drawing straight pencil looking lines with crayons, would have had to have drawn this rocket ship and put it in front of the child, because the child can't manifest that themselves. Similarly, with our idea of God, we can't manifest that ourselves. The idea of God is like the blueprint of the rocket ship in our mind, but our brain is like a piece of paper, and I got 4 crayons that I'm rubbing all over it, trying to make it work. And so Descartes says, well, the only thing that could have caused that most perfect conception of God in my mind is something equal to or greater than that conception, which would be God himself. Therefore, God exists, says Descartes. Okay, so there you go. Now we've done an ontological proof. You got Descartes' version. Satisfying or not, that's what Descartes argues. Okay, so ontological proof done. Moving on to number 2. We got the cosmological proof for God's existence. Okay, so cosmological proof comes to us in its first iteration from Aristotle, who here is waiting for the basketball to bounce back up into his hand as he dribbles it down. It's also in what we read for today by Aquinas, with he's sort of a monstrous giant in this picture, with a church and a book that are the same size. Sometimes I feel like my books are that big as I drown in them. And it's also given to us in the Enlightenment period by Leibniz, the most beautifully wigged man in all of existence. Leibniz is just, he's a king all the way through. The guy was awesome. He invented calculus. He built bridges. He was the appointed librarian of Hanover. He tried to unify the Protestants and Catholics philosophically, and alienated both of them, because they're both like, screw you, dude. You're with us or you're against us, and was just brilliant. I mean, as an author, he has this like poetic power, and especially in his analogies and metaphors, to tell stories that convey like complex philosophical points so simply and beautifully. Okay, enough Leibniz love. Cosmological proof. From cosmos, for the universe, or totality, and again, logos, principles of. So the cosmological proof is going to be a proof for God's existence based on the principles of the way the universe is. Okay, so here goes. 1, all things that exist have a cause. We've seen this before, principle of sufficient reason, right? The universe is a thing that exists. There it is. Therefore, the universe must have a cause, right? This all makes sense so far. The only sort of thing that could have caused the universe is God. Therefore, God caused the universe. And here's your deductive formulation of it. Again, don't try to understand it, just to show you that it is a valid proof.
Yeah, I didn't believe you that it was, but once I saw that,
Does God exist?
If everything has a cause, doesn't God have a cause?
Ah, very good. All things that exist have a cause, but built into this proof is that God caused the universe, right? So we can subtract God away from this proof and say something caused the universe. But even then, the objection stands. Wouldn't the thing which has caused all of the rest of it, wouldn't that thing also need a cause? And so do we just get turtles all the way down, right? Do we know the turtles all the way down? I said this before. Does anybody remember? I don't want to repeat the story if it's.
I think the idea has come up before, but I don't know if that story has.
So I think it's a Native American tale, but the idea is a kid walks up to the elder and says, I'm standing on the earth, right? And it's what holds me up, what holds up the earth. And the elder says the earth rests on the back of a great turtle, okay? And the child, being the irritating 5-year-old that we all once were, says, why? Or to the point of the question, well, what does that turtle rest on, right? So if I'm standing on the earth and that holds me up, and the earth is on a turtle and that holds the earth up, which holds me up, what holds that turtle up? And the elder says, oh, a turtle. And the child, confused, okay, that makes sense, right? So here I am being held up by the earth, which is held up by a turtle. And if that turtle could hold everything, then another turtle could do the same. But then what holds that turtle? And the elder smiles and says, it's turtles all the way down, right? So this is your objection here, right? Is that it's turtles all the way down. Given the principle of sufficient reason, all things that exist must have a sufficient cause, or a cause that sufficiently explains their having been caused. The universe is a thing that exists, so there must be sufficient explanation for its existence, its being caused. The thing that caused it, shouldn't that also, it stands to reason that causing force should also itself have a sufficient explanation itself, right? This is a problem. So the idea is that you postulate a stopgap. So this is what Aristotle does, and he calls it the unmoved mover. He is not theologically inclined. Okay, so he's not interested in proving the existence of a God really at all. At least so far as I know, that you get some strange, like, Egyptian mystery school tie-ins sometimes, but none of that is stuff that I know anything about. So just given like reading him, he's interested in like the principles of motion and causality. So that the metaphysics is the book that is written after the physics. So in physics, he defines how like forces cause one another to move things, and how things amalgam, and how time works and stuff. Basically like what you would learn in a physics class today, but the same concepts you would learn in a physics class today, though with like completely incorrect principles, because he was the first person to really do it. The metaphysics is where he says, okay, if this is how all of the causes work, then what can we abstract from these like causal interactions and forces of the world? And so it's on the basis of like how the world works that Aristotle is interested in this idea of an unmoved mover, rather than from a theological conception, or one of like trying to put valid feet on convictions of faith. So what Aristotle does is exactly this kind of proof. He says, look, well, the universe exists, it must have a cause, just like everything else. But we can't have this turtles up, we can't have this regression infinitely. That's a problem. It's just as much a problem to, or maybe less of a problem, to suppose that there can be an infinite series of causes all the way back, as it is to suggest that there should be a first cause. And so what Aristotle ends up claiming is that there's this unmoved mover, this first turner of the wheel, right, to get the ball rolling, but does not move themselves. And so that this is supposed to be the name for God in this proof is unmoved mover for Aristotle. And you have sort of a postulation. You stipulate that whatever it is that caused the rest of it is not like the rest of it, so it was able to cause it. And principally, it would need to be in not being like the rest of it, the cosmos. That thing that caused it would itself be uncaused. And again, you get some interesting theological tie-ins here too, which is why, this cosmological proof is satisfied by just about anything. So Big Bang satisfies the cosmological proof, right? The universe is a thing that must have a cause is really all that we get out of the cosmological proof. And the Big Bang could be, again, we could substitute God for Big Bang or whatever, flying spaghetti meatball monster, who knows? What matters for the cosmological proof is just that there is a thing that causes the universe separate from the universe itself. Whether or not that be God is an extra step. Right? And when I say God, whether or not that be the God of the theologians is an extra step. So you might say, this is Leibniz's move. Leibniz makes the cosmological proof and then says, oh, hey, I'm a good God-fearing Christian. Great, I have a thing to fill in that explanation, that explanatory gap. There must have been a thing that caused the universe, and I already believe in God, so it's kind of convenient, right? Okay, so what's wrong with the argument? How do we object to this? So, and I should also say, I should have said this earlier. Insofar as we're distinguishing between the God of the theologians and the God of the philosophers, for those of you who have theistic backgrounds, who believe in God, it's sort of an interesting schism. So oftentimes when believers confront these proofs, they still believe, but they don't like the proofs, right? Because your belief in God is supposed to be something other than, or really often very much consists in something other than like these abstract, raw theoretical principles and rules of inference, right? So when we're evaluating these proofs and saying like, what's wrong with the argument? When I ask, does God exist? Just being goofy, but the idea is what can we show is problematic about the form of reasoning, rather than about like, whether or not God actually exists. That's not so much the concern here as it is to investigate whether or not we think that our principles of reason allow us to make such a claim at all, right? Theoretically speaking. And likewise, whether as theists, if we are to be theists, this sort of proof is mappable onto the structure of our belief, because I think it's interesting that it's often not. So that's just to like hopefully invite everybody of all backgrounds into objecting here, and maybe even to hopefully inspire the more theistic among us to object and say why these arguments are wrong. So you wanted to object?
Yeah, I think premise 1 isn't necessarily true.
Whoa.
I don't have like a very good argument, but I read one article and it gave examples in all of our models of physics of uncaused events that still, satisfied our models of physics. That's not like that doesn't prove that there are uncaused events, but it's like, seems like a good objection anyway.
Okay, so there are some interesting and famous experiments out there. So for instance, I can't remember the name of the guys that did this, but you get two metal plates and you push them really close together, like atoms close to, like imagine that my hands aren't an inch apart, but like an atom apart. And in such small spaces, in the vacuum created by that small space, we've measured particles that appear to like pop in and out of existence, right? What's probably happening here is that our measurement tools are mistaken or imprecise. Though you could be real spoopy and interpret this as particles exist and stop existing and just sort of like, right? And if that's the case, then principle of sufficient reason is troubled when we zoom in to that scale, like the one atom scale of size. And if it doesn't hold everywhere, then it's not really cosmological anymore. And so that's an issue. I tend not to think this way. I tend to think that our measurement tools are imprecise, and it might even be like an epistemic problem that we're imprecise. And the way that we conceive of natural phenomenon is just like we can't, that might be the case as well. I err more towards that side of skepticism than I do towards spookier speculations.
The article I read,
But not incontrovertibly.
the examples it gave were like theoretical, like here's like basically just math problems where it would be like, oh, in Newtonian physics, you can have this uncaused event that follows all the rules. But the premise of the article was kind of, well, we couldn't know for sure if like physics was causal unless we had a theory of everything, which we don't. So it kind of looked at what we do have.
Yeah, so I mean, this is true of all scientific principles and laws, is you bootstrap them, right? You say, well, everything so far works this way, so I just assume gravity works, period. Now it can change given location and object of mass and speed and stuff, but typically it works this way, and so we bootstrap from what we do have. Given that we are finite beings, right? So we could say that the principle of sufficient reason is, at least if it's a law, usually not incontrovertible, not totally always, it's not necessarily true, right? It might be contingent. So good, that's a good objection. What else we got? It's too convenient.
Yeah.
What's wrong with being convenient? Oh, I see. Okay, so it's the idea of God causing the universe that's too convenient. So what if we just got rid of the God language and we said all things that exist have a cause, the universe is a thing that exists, therefore the universe must have a cause. The only sort of thing that could have caused the universe is something other than the universe, therefore something other than the universe caused it. So we abstract away from like the realizing force. Say it's not God, but something that is unlike everything else.
No, I'm saying that you said that God doesn't have thought.
Mhm.
Isn't it just too convenient to say that? In order
I see.
to make the argument valid?
Yeah, so in order to make the argument valid, you would need to stipulate the existence of like an unmoved mover type thing, something that doesn't cause there to be turtles all the way down. And so we could, what would that be like, to deny the inference to step 3 and say, look, it can be turtles all the way down, and it might very well be. And you're trying to force in a law of nature that is not at all very clear in saying that a being, be it God or Big Bang or flying spaghetti meatball monster, whatever, with different existential properties than the rest of the cosmos caused it, so it's not turtles all the way down. In stipulating that sort of thing, you're positing a law of nature that isn't necessarily the case. Sure. Okay, so we could give up premise 1, which seems that we're not always so excited about our scientific intuitions anyways. We could, we probably don't want to give up premise 2, right? You could, it'd be a little weird. You'd be like Berkeley, who says, we're all ideas in the mind of God. None of us actually exist. We're all just ideas. Right? So there are idealists out there. Okay. We could deny premise 4 and do the turtles all the way down thing. And again, accepting this argument doesn't commit us to the existence of any particular kind of God. It only commits us to the existence of the sort of thing that could cause the universe. So let's just skip through this because we already did it. Okay, so we've done the 2 classical forms of deductive proof for God's existence. Let's move on to this empirical teleological proof, the inductive one, the probability-based one. Okay, so This comes to us from William Paley. Some of you may be familiar that this one tends to be more popularized than the other two, like the Watchmaker argument, right? So again, we talked about causes a little bit, and telos sort of being like the end at which all human activity aims is happiness, right? The telos of being human is to like achieve happiness, like our purpose. Before we even decide like who we are, what we want to do with our lives, our purpose insofar as like we share in human nature is to strive towards happiness. This is the sort of thing that a telos is. Similarly for existence, existence has a sort of telos or principle, or we could, it says, suppose that it does based on probability. And that what we're doing in a teleological proof is taking evidence and using that evidence to support the idea that all of existence in general has a similar sort of end or principle for the sake of which it exists. So it's kind of a nice passage. As Paley says, in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had been lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. The rock could have been there forever, and I can't prove that it wasn't. But suppose I'd found a watch on the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. That would be just as absurd. There must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed the watch for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater or more, and that in degree which exceeds all computation. Okay, so I'll talk about this example in a moment, but it's interesting, at least at sort of this holistic level, to look at this is like the whole argument right here. And what happens in it is we see a difference in explanation. So I can explain a rock being there as it's a part of the natural world. So it could have always been there just like the rest of the natural world. But if I stumble upon a watch, it is unlike the rest of the natural world. It is disanalogous with the rest. So we have natural world full of rocks and trees and drizzling rain. And then we have designed objects like watches and shoes and halfway broken clickers and televisions and Zoom software, you know? And these are objects disanalogous with the rest of the natural world. They're unlike it because they were created with purpose and with design, that an idea and a conception came to reality to form disparate elements of the world into what we see in these designed objects. So there's a disanalogy between natural world and designed features of the world, and our explanations for why they are what they are different. Natural objects are just, they could have always been there, part of the natural world. Designed objects aren't, but wait, let's build back the analogy. If we find enough evidence in the natural world to show that the natural world is actually like the watch and like designed objects like software and TVs and half broken clickers and stuff, then we might also be able to show that it has a purpose in it as well. Okay, so let's break it down. Entity E within nature, or the cosmos or nature itself, so like the rock that Paley stumbles on is E, is like specified human artifact A, machine of the watch. In relevant aspects are that there are shared qualities are between the watch and some feature of nature. A, the human artifact, has are the properties that make it like nature, precisely because it's a product of deliberate design by intelligent human agency. Like effects typically have like causes, or like explanations, like existence requirements, etc. Right? So if something is wet, it probably was in contact with water. And if another thing is wet, it was probably in contact with water. So like we can tell from wetness that there's a similar cause, like being in contact with water. Therefore, it is highly probable that E, the entity within nature, has R, the properties that make it like a designed object, precisely because it too is a product of deliberate design by intelligent, relevantly human-like agency. Okay, so here the idea is to draw the analogy using these shared properties, R, between a natural object and a designed object, and then to stipulate that because like products have like causes, we can say that the natural object, insofar as it shares these properties with the designed object, has similar causes, which would be intelligent design. And we should note that it's highly probable. It doesn't prove incontrovertible. It doesn't say, like, it's not a valid proof. The conclusion isn't necessitated by the premises, right? Just because I say that all swans are white doesn't, because I've seen only white swans, doesn't mean that there can't be a black swan, right? I'm just rather stipulating that's really probable that all swans are white, because I've never had any evidence to the contrary. Okay, this is different than a deductive proof. So again, just to sort of zoom out and clarify what's going on here, is we're saying that the probability of nature having an intelligent designer is greater given that it shares certain properties with objects that we intelligently design ourselves. Properties that might be shared are the homeostasis of ecohabitats or niches, or the highly specific selected functions of different beaks of Galapagos-based birds, right? That there are sort of like these perceived perfections in nature, the way that it all just sort of hooks together and works. It's not all a bunch of random mishappen chaos. It kind of makes sense. Just like when I look at a watch, say, this sort of makes sense to me. I can break it apart and look at its pieces. I can analyze it. And the world is kind of like that too. And if it shares that property, then what makes the watch sensible, intelligible, is the fact that it was designed by a watchmaker. What makes the world, therefore, intelligible in an analog fashion is that it had an intelligent designer, or at least it more probably did, right? So it's not proving that there is an intelligent designer. It's just saying, well, the watch probably, I don't know who made it, but it was probably made by somebody. Similar with the world. I don't know who made it, but it was probably made by somebody. Okay. So does God probably exist?
Okay, so you said that God was all good, omnibenevolent.
Yeah.
So why would God create a world that has evil?
Good. So this is we'll deal with this problem in entirety. Well, not in the problem's entirety, but in the entirety of next week's lecture, we'll deal with the problem of evil. So good, though, to point out that the sort of omnibenevolent God, the intelligent designer here, may not be consistent with the world that we are saying makes the existence of a God in general highly probable. So again, like the cosmological proof, this proof doesn't make the tri-omni-perfect God probable. It's really only the ontological proof that gets you the tri-omni stuff. This proof only gets you an intelligent designer. It could be an evil genius, right? Could really be anybody. Just has to be something that can conceive of everything that is and put the purpose, the telos, into the world so that it has the sort of harmonic works together qualities. Those are properties. But yeah, you don't. This proof doesn't make the Christian God probable. It's only by a leap from the theological convictions that, say, Paley probably had to these rational convictions that he argues for in his work, that you get the sort of connection to that God. But you're right to say that, yeah, it could have been, like the really smart and powerful Steve. Who's that? I don't know, but he did all this stuff, right? And you might think that there are some features of the world that, even if they were intelligently designed, would have to be designed by a pretty either negligent or awful or very much risk-seeking even taking kind of being, like how hyenas eat animals while they're still alive. Like you watch these awful videos, and it's like, circle of life. It's the way nature works. Even that, like, maybe it's not animal on animal violence. Maybe it's like, we'll talk about this example, like a forest fire burning a baby like Bambi, right? A baby fawn in the woods. That's pretty awful. Or, all the awful crap that we do to each other on a day-to-day basis. We cut each other off in traffic. That sucks. We cause traffic. We are traffic. That's evil. Okay, so this proof doesn't make probable the existence of the theological God, but rather an intelligent designer, period. Right? So good objection. Anybody else?
Well, in the reading, it says Hume devastated the teleological argument. That it's mostly.
Yeah, that's devastated is,
Yeah.
what's the word? It's devastating that anybody would be so flamboyant in their language concerning these sensitive debates. So, I mean, like Hume's whole thing is like the problem of induction, like we can't prove that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. So this whole proof is an induction. Any claim to probability requires an inductive step. You say that all of my evidence says this, and this is all of my evidence, and I have this idea that corresponds with the evidence. And so when I conclusion on the basis of evidence, I'm not doing a deduction, I'm doing an induction. I'm saying that it's probable that, and Hume says you have no license to say anything is true on the basis of probability. And so saying that God exists on the basis of the like design-like features of the world is an impossible step. Now, also, Hume would say, look, the world doesn't actually have the features that make it look like it's designed. And we can't connect the features of the world even to the point where we get these are properties. But that's the sort of spirit of the objection there. How about online? Any thoughts about the intelligent design watchmaker argument?
I do think this one's the most fun.
You think this one's the most fun? Yeah.
Well, isn't it like natural selection, Charles Darwin, that makes the world look like it is? It's a natural process. That's our not understanding.
Well, yeah. So Darwin had his own religious convictions too, and for all of his Darwinian revolution, his postulation of evolutionary biology, how speciation works, how that species aren't perfect forms designed to be as they were, nor did they species, that is, change themselves in this Lamarckian way, like giraffes stretching their necks, and so their necks get longer, right? He had his own religious convictions, and he, withheld publishing a lot of his work because he was worried about the blowback. And if you are theistic and you want to accept the story of evolutionary biology, and at the same time that there are teleological properties in nature, these need not be contradictory premises to hold together. Because you could say that the process of speciation and evolution and natural selection is in its form producing, though chaotic methods, something like an intelligent design, like something that would require that, then I think that's a valid claim to make. Whether or not it holds up is, I think, up to you and how well you can argue for that point. But I think Darwin certainly felt that way, that he wasn't disproving the existence of God on the basis of the way that nature works. In fact, he was just revealing another one of like sort of the divine mysteries and features of our existence here. but yeah, you would have to take a step back. You wouldn't say that like the species itself is the evidence of, but rather the process, the background form of cause that creates the species as they are, and is constantly creating them, would be the in this argument would count as E, the natural entity.
Could you say number 2 doesn't hold up because human agency isn't a thing?
Yeah, you could. So you could deny human agency. This is a good objection. You could deny human agency and say, look, A doesn't have these design-like properties because we put them there. And so the analogy breaks down then. So like things have like causes. So say you're like the hard determinist that would say that there are no other causes other than what's written. I don't, so this is an objection to the premise, but you might get a different form of the same argument from rejecting the premise in this way. So like things have like causes, and no things are caused by humans, but no things are caused by anything except for the written law of nature and the natural world as it is. So all things in it, insofar as they are written and determined completely, are alike in causal form that way, which is also, given the structure of this argument, evidence for the probability of a designer of that completely hard determinist system. Now, whether or not that's the move that gets made, I think there are other ways to go, but that would be a way to sort of protect the argument from this kind of objection, which I think is a good one. It's clever to reject agency and say, well, there's no design in the watch, so who's to say there's design in the world? Now, the alternative would be to go the indeterminist way. As a hard determinist, you might sort of be pressed by my rebuttal. As an indeterminist, you wouldn't have to be. Say it's all chaos. Yeah. How about it? Anybody online? We're all online convinced that God probably exists. Or we're not triggered to responding by my edgy questions.
I just feel like it's a weird analogy and I can't articulate it. Like, I feel like the universe just isn't a machine in that way. I don't know.
So, okay, the universe isn't a machine in that way. So the analogy is from designed object, artifact, to natural world. If we break down the connection between artifact and natural world, then those R properties don't inherent in either, and so we lose the like causes have, or like effects have like causes sort of inference. So this is very much like what Hume says. Hume says nature and the various things in it are not at all like human artifacts and objects. In fact, human artifacts exhibit substantial differences from things like rocks. For instance, natural things are alive and human things are not, right? This is a big difference. And so the analogy that there is some set of properties are shared by natural objects and human artifacts breaks down. The analogy just doesn't work because natural objects look nothing like human artifacts. And we might say that there's some, spooky property of the way that ecosystems and, specialized species hold together in their habitats. But even then, none of that looks like human stuff, right?
Well, can you argue that AI is alive?
Maybe. You might be able to argue that AI is alive. And that's all I'll say about that. Okay, so we've proved God's existence 3 times. How about that? So let's take a break. Let's take 5 minutes, come back at 6:20. and then we'll do Pascal's wager and close out for the day. So I'm going to pause the. Oh, welcome back. Let's do Pascal's wager. So what we've done so far is shown that God exists, a cause for the universe exists, which is probably God, and we've also shown that God probably exists. Now, what we're going to show is that we're all better off believing that God exists, regardless of everything else. We're doing ourselves a favor when we believe in God, regardless of God's existence. Okay, and this comes to us from Pascal, who's kind of an interesting guy. Pascal, 1600s, Bohemian dude, gambler, drinker, partier, really smart, awesome mathematician. I think is one of the first people, or maybe the first person, to discover that oxygen gets thinner and like air pressure changes when you go up to altitude, because he sent his friend up to altitude to measure it for him. He said, go do this, and had his friend climb a mountain. So charismatic, probably as well. Anyways, he is kind of bored of boozing and partying and gambling, and has pretty much solved poker because he invents probabilistic logic, the inductive expected utility calculus. So he like solves the games that he's playing, gets bored with them, and then decides, you know what I should do? I should apply my mind to bigger and better things, and so gives us the wager concerned with God. So before we get into that, I'm going to talk a little bit about expected utility, which we've seen before in our discussion of utilitarianism. So now we're at this point in the semester where we've already been seeing in all of our comments today and last week and going forward, this beginning to blend together of many of the concepts that we've learned. We should see these interrelations between ideas and thinkers and forms of reasoning and argument even. And that'll only continue to grow as you continue on in a philosophical education. Anyways, expected utility is sort of what Bentham and Mill say is what you want as a utilitarian. You want to calculate what the utility of the consequences are, and then choose the consequence of the action that produces the most utility, gives you the least harm and the most good. Okay. So we also have this principle of instrumental rationality, which is supposed to be like a part of human nature if you are a boring economist or a very basic inductive logician. So the idea is that if a person has goal G and believes that doing A is the best way of achieving goal G, then the person will do A. This is called being a straightforward maximizer. There's all sorts of complications that you can throw into this, which is why most economics is based on an idea of a rational agent that is completely mistaken and faulty. Anyways, we're not going to do that in this class. The idea is simple, that we all want what's best for us. So we go after it. This is what's rational. And rational choice theory just says that we should be instrumental in our rationality. We should always figure out what the best choices for us are and go after them. So in order to do this, we need to collapse our goals and beliefs into preferences. What gives us more utility? What gives us less utility, etc. Second, we need to order the our and agent's preferences via assigning utilities. So we say, I prefer A to B, and I prefer A 5 more than I prefer B. So A plus 5, B 0 or something, right? And finally, we reformulate instrumental rationality as person S will choose the action that maximizes their utility. We get Bentham and Mill. Now we can do a sort of rough and ready calculation of this with probabilities and bets. So say you can choose your bet. You can choose a 50% chance at winning $200 or a 1% chance at winning $7,000. What do you do? It's an actual question.
7,000 for sure.
1% chance at $7,000. Who? So online too. Now you don't have to talk, but you do have to move your body. So who would do the 50% chance of winning $200? Online. Looks like most people online. Who would do the 1% chance at 7,000? Okay. Rachel, that's cheating, Rachel. You didn't move your body, you just used the hand up. And now you give me a thumbs up.
Externalized.
Zoom University, man. It's a brave new world out here. Okay. So your expected utility is 100 taking the first bet and only 7 taking the second bet. So if you decided to take the second bet, you are not rational, or you're bad at math, or rational choice theory is wrong.
Or all
Take your
of the
pick.
above.
Or all the above. Why not? ¿Por qué no los dos? So we can also measure probabilities like mixed together, right? So you could have a 25% chance of winning 200 and a 75% chance of winning $50. And this ends up being sort of somewhere in the middle. So this is doing math. The way that the math works is we take certain acts, we take certain consequences of the acts, we assign utilities to the consequences, just numbers, and then we assign probabilities to the consequences. Okay, so we say each consequence has a certain number-based utility. It also has a certain probability of occurring. And the expected value of an act is the probability of one consequence occurring multiplied by the utility of the consequence plus the probability of the next consequence multiplied by the utility of the next consequence. So it's just the sum of products and probabilities of an action. If going to class today takes 3 hours of my life with 100% chance, then I lose 3, but I also gain an infinite amount of value and wisdom and knowledge because philosophy is awesome. So -3 versus infinity, I get a whole lot more value from going to class, right? We just assign utilities and probabilities to consequences and actions. So say, for instance, a lottery ticket has 100 tickets and just one winning ticket with a prize of $90. What is the expected value of buying a ticket for $1? Does anybody want to try this before we like break it down?
Like 90 cents or something.
90 cents or something. So the consequence, one is you win. The utility of winning is $90, and the probability of it is 1%, 0.01, right? So your second consequence is you lose. Your ticket is not drawn. You lose $1, right? Because you paid $1 to buy into the bet. And the probability of this occurring is 99%, right? There's like 100 tickets, okay? So our expected utility of taking the bet, the action being like, I'm going to buy in, is the probability of the first consequence times its utility, plus the probability of the second consequence minus its utility. So this ends up being 1% times 90 minus 1. Yeah, 90 minus 1 is, I think, what that is supposed to say. Because the utility is 90 and then you paid 1 to get the bet. Yeah. Plus 0.99 times -1. So your expected utility is minus a penny. So if you are the house and you sell this bet, you make money. If you're the chump, you lose a penny every time you buy in, probabilistically speaking. You had a question?
So is it 0.1 times 9? That minus 1? Or 90?
Times 89. Yeah. Yeah. It's not one of those Facebook math problems. Okay. So Pascal's wager is going to be in this spirit. What we're going to do is we're going to take certain actions. It's going to be belief in God or not. And we're going to assign utilities. We're going to determine the consequences. Then we're going to measure the utilities against one another to see what should we do. Should we take the bet or should we not? So as Pascal says, God is or he is not. But to which side shall we incline? Reason can decide nothing here. So obviously he objects to the ontological proof. There is an infinite chaos which separated us. A game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn up. Which will you choose then? Let us see. Since you must choose, let us see which interests you least. You have 2 things to lose, the true and the good, and 2 things to stake, your reason and your will, your knowledge and your happiness. And your nature has 2 things to shun, error and misery. Your reason is no more shocked in choosing one rather than the other, since you must of necessity choose. But your happiness? Let us weigh the gain and loss in wagering that God is. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then, without hesitating, that he is. This is like super epic, right? This is like you're crossing a foggy bridge at night and some hunchback troll-like figure waddles up to you and waxes poetic and like commits you somehow to like betting on the existence of God, right? And that's what I imagine when I hear this quote. Is that just me?
That's very dramatic.
Okay, cool. So foggy bridge and hunchback figure. So what Pascal is urging us to do here is to bet that God exists, because we're better off in either case, that God exists or doesn't, than the alternative that we bet that God doesn't exist. So we can say that there are two actions, A and B, and that there are two consequences, X and Y. And there are certain utilities assigned to each state of affairs given certain action, certain consequence. Okay. And this setup, this probability calculus, is due to Pascal. Okay. So our acts are, we can be an atheist or we can be a believer. We can choose to believe in God or we can choose not to believe in God. So A, atheist, B, believer. States of affairs, God exists, G, or God does not exist, N. Okay. So there's two ways of thinking. You can think that God exists or you can think that God doesn't exist. And there's two possible ways that the world can be. It could be that God exists or it could be that God doesn't exist. 50-50 in both cases. Or, well, reason can't decide. There's no principle upon which we can determine the existence of God or not, according to Pascal, that the probabilities, as far as we're epistemically aware, are equal in either case. At least this is how he sets it up. So you might say that there's more evidence in one way or another, but that's going to turn out not to matter. It just makes the case a little more interesting and catchy if we make it even probabilities in both cases. So how do we fill out the probabilities? Well, we get Gnosticism, agnosticism, atheism, theism. So we can be theists or we can sort of withhold belief. We could also be believers. We'll begin by assuming perfect agnosticism. As I just said, we'll say like, it could be 50-50. I don't really know, one way or the other. Who knows what we're supposed to say? So we're going to assign probability 0.5 to the existence of God and probability 0.5 to the non-existence of God, meaning that there's a 50% chance that God exists and a 50% chance that God doesn't exist. We're perfect agnostics, right? We withhold belief perfectly, okay? So how do we assign the utilities, right? So we have our probabilities. That's only one part of the calculus. We also need to assign utilities. So from the Gospel Mark, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. Failing to believe in God, should God exist, results in a terrible penalty, eternal damnation. No, you don't want to be eternally damned. It's not good for you or your soul or really anybody around you. So the utility of being an atheist, A, given God's existence, G, is negative infinity, eternal suffering and damnation. You're really, really bad off. It is not good for you, okay? So it's also the case that he that believeth shall be, and is baptized, shall be saved. So if you believe in God and God exists and you're baptized, then you go to heaven, okay? So the utility of believing in God, given God's existence, is infinitely good. You enjoy the beatific vision, you sit on a cloud and it's light and you get to wear an airy robe that feels nice and, float around and look at your living relatives or, whatever, sit, pat your childhood pet on the head, whatever you do in heaven, you get to do that stuff. And it's infinitely fantastic. Okay. So we now have utilities assigned to the event that God exists in both the case that we are atheists and in the case that we're believers. But what if God doesn't exist? So for this, we'll just say that, say I'm an atheist and God doesn't exist. And it's the 1600s. I get no benefit. Just okay, great, you got it, but you don't get anything for it. It's just darkness after you die. But say you're a believer and God doesn't exist in the 1600s. You get to take part in the religious community. You are not a pariah of your people. You are not, at least in say like Europe or whatever, right? In Pascal's sort of hometown. you're sort of welcomed in. You get to enjoy the resources of the church, etc. The educational lessons. It's like really good to be a believer. It's less good to be an atheist. So we'll say like probability or utility 1,000. You get some benefit from being a believer, even if God doesn't exist. Like, you got all the good stuff, material human stuff, anyways. So we can also apply this rule of dominance, which is a rule of probability theory. It just says that if in at least one state of affairs, one act has more utility than every other act and never has less utility, then it dominates. It's the one you should always choose. And what act here dominates? B. Yeah, being a believer always dominates, because in either case, whether God exists or doesn't, you always get more utility. Therefore, bet that God exists. You're always better off. Okay. But we can change the case a little bit. We can change our utilities. We can make it so that belief doesn't dominate and then see if things remain the same. So let's say that if God doesn't exist, then you've acquired a bit of utility via the pleasures of a secular lifestyle. So by not believing in God and God doesn't exist, then you didn't waste your Sundays going to mass, and you were able to study for 2 extra hours and get, a higher percentage score on your civil service test, and now you're the president of the world. Good for you. And you wouldn't have been able to do that if you had spent an extra hour on Sundays in mass, right? So let's say that if God exists and you're an atheist, then you still go to hell. Sorry. But if God doesn't exist and you didn't spend all that time on Sundays believing and reading the Bible and saying your prayers and going to confession and all that, then you have plus 1,000 utility. However, if you believe in God and God does not exist, then maybe you've missed out on some secular opportunity. That God doesn't exist, and you could have spent those extra hours reading for your civil service exam to become president of the world. So really, you're kind of missing out, and you're worse off for believing, given that God doesn't exist. So now what we've done is we've broken the domination thing, right? That belief no longer dominates, okay? Because it's not always better than being an atheist in the case that God doesn't exist. So what do we say about this case? We do an expected utility calculus. We take the probability of God's existing times the probability that God does, plus the probability of God not existing times the probability times the utility negative 500. And then we do the same thing for the other side of the equation. And turns out that when you multiply by infinity, you get negative or positive infinity based on its valence. So regardless of what you do, the expected utility calculus still tells us, even when belief doesn't dominate, that we're always better off believing. If you are a rational agent, given rational choice theory and straightforward maximization, by performing the utility calculus, assuming these are our utilities for the existence or not of God, you are always better off wagering on a belief in God's existence, because your expected utility is positive infinity, as opposed to the negative infinity utility that you can expect from not believing in God. What's wrong with the argument? Are we all about to wager our happiness and existential will and good faith on God? Are we about to throw it all on the poker table of life? Yeah.
Well, you can definitely argue that 50% probability, but like there are ways to tell, or if you're not a complete agnostic.
Yeah, so you could shift the probabilities, but would that change the calculation? Yeah.
But I mean, well, no, technically not.
So if we want to make if we want to object mathematically this way, then we would need to object to the form of the utility calculus. Say it's not actually giving us the sort of value that we want. If we say that so let's change the probability of God existing to 0.00000 repeating 1 at the end, right? You would still get infinite utility from believing in God in this case, right? And infinite negative utility in not believing in God. That might not accord with our theories of rationality. Nobody would ever bet on a 0.0 repeating 1 at the end wager ever on anything. even if it promised like total perfect infinite happiness at the cost of whatever, it's a bad bet. And so maybe the utility calculus isn't doing what we want when we start to imagine infinite utilities in one way or another. Good. Jason.
Oh, it seems like to really make a decision, you'd have to do this process for like every god that might
Good.
exist.
Good.
And
So
that seems like not worthwhile.
this is where I'm going. In order to do this kind of calculation thoroughly, responsibly, you're not just betting on a Christian God, you're betting on all sorts of divine powers, right? So the many gods problem. Pascal assumes that there are only two choices, right? That our construction is a 4x4. There are only two outcomes, but this isn't strictly true. We can conceive just like Descartes did of an evil genius. It's possible, right? The whole practical argument rests upon the existence or non-existence of this Christian God that Pascal is postulating. But what if other gods can exist as well? Not that, like, it's not just that the Christian God is possible, like that God remains possible, but there's other possible gods out there as well. Our practical choice must change, and so must our calculus. So let's imagine that there's not only the possibility that an all-good Christian God exists, but also that another two may exist among the many pantheons and sects of gods postulated by the multitude of world religions. We are only interested in the possible existence of this particular God right here, this fancy dandy-looking man. Okay, so this God is an evil trickster who condemns sloppy practical reasoning. Pascal. He's spiteful and full of wrath. And so when believers are deceived and rely on their poor and meager personal interests to infer that the almighty and good Christian God exists, our spiteful tricksters beset with anger. Damn it, he doesn't exist, right? Or really, damn you, he doesn't exist. He despises those who forsake and forget him. Those who believe in the Christian God are punished. Yet those who remain agnostic do not commit such a terrible crime for our trickster and may yet go to heaven. So, if this is our 4x4, if we're including another choice and another outcome, we need to change the system. We need to add one in each case. So our partitions will change as well. So you could be an atheist, a believer, or agnostic. These are our options. The Christian God could exist, the trickster God could exist, or no God could exist. So we fill out our utilities. In the case that we are a believer and God exists, we go to heaven, beatific vision, fantastic. In the case that the trickster God exists and we believe in God, negative infinity, that's real bad. He's going to punish us because we believed in the wrong God. And if no God exists, then, you missed out on your hours of studying for the civil service exam, whatever the example is. Okay, so in the case that you're agnostic and God exists, well, you weren't a believer, sorry, damnation. In the case that the trickster God exists and you're agnostic, then he sends you to trickster God heaven. And if you're agnostic and God doesn't exist, then you still didn't spend your time in mass, right? And finally, if you're an atheist, both the existence of the actual Christian God and the trickster God that we've postulated here would send you to hell. Too bad. But you not only didn't spend your time in mass on Sundays, but you didn't even spend any time thinking about it, right? So plus 1,000, right? Okay, so let's do an expected utility calculus. Nothing dominates. There's no one choice that's always better than the rest and never worse. So here's the expected utility calculation, just putting it all in for believing, for being an agnostic, and for disbelieving. Okay, so our expected utility is negative 100, 500, or negative infinity in the case of disbelief. So when we consider the notion of the jealous and spiteful trickster God, our answer to this problem is no longer so clear. No one utility dominates the bunch, and crucially, what we ought to do depends on the utilities assigned in the third column, right? Because here we have the positive and negative infinities of the belief and agnostic categories canceling each other out. So however we assign utilities in the non-existence case is what's going to give us the best wager, right? Which again, we might not think is actually so great for practical reasoning purposes. We might not like how this kind of calculus treats infinite utilities. But at least in the case of disbelief, being an atheist, we're always worse off because it's not canceled out. The trickster God and the regular God punish us. Now, we could say that the trickster God might send you to heaven if you're an atheist and do the same sort of thing there. But in this many gods case problem, we don't get the clear partition and we don't get the clear wager that Pascal makes out to seem so compelling, right? The spooky voice speaking eloquently from the fog on the bridge, think, oh God, yeah, better like start believing. When you start to add in alternative possibilities, the wager gets more complicated, the expected utility calculus gets a little stranger, and we no longer know how to bet. Okay. Questions? No. I won't ask it again. Take care. See you next week. Next week, we'll do the problem of evil. So this week we did proofs for God's existence. The problem of evil is going to be arguments against the existence of God, given the conditions of the world, and also a defense or rebuttal against those arguments. So we're going to talk about Theodicy, which is the sort of story that you tell in order to make consistent these problematic features of the world with the existence of a God. And we'll talk about some historical ones from famous theologians and philosophers and like Aquinas, and also from contemporary philosophers of religion. Cool. So take care. Till next week.
Thank you.